Hello everyone, welcome to Kids Auto and Truck Repair. Today we have a 2005 Honda Odyssey. The customer complaint on this vehicle is the check engine light remains on the dash while the engine is running. The customer also stated that the engine is shaking severely under the hood. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna go in the vehicle so we can confirm the customer's complaint. After confirming the customer's complaint, we're gonna connect a scan tool to the vehicle so we can scan the engine computer. So now let's go in the vehicle. So as you can hear, the engine is running and the check engine light is on the dash. So right here, check engine light remains on. So customer's complaint confirmed. As you can see, the check engine light is flashing and the vehicle is shaking tremendously right now. It feels like this engine is misfiring. There is a misfiring cylinder or cylinders on this engine. Okay, so customer's complaint confirmed. I'm gonna turn off the engine. I'm gonna turn the key on. I'm gonna get the scan tool connected to the vehicle and then I will bring you guys back up. I got the scan tool connected. I'm gonna bring it up. So let's scan the engine computer and see what codes we have. This is a Honda. Let's auto ID the vehicle. The scan tool has identified the vehicle, 2005 Honda Odyssey with a 3.5 liter. We're gonna click OK. Let's do a code scan. Let's scan all the control units on the vehicle and see what we got. We have one trouble code in the engine computer. The code we have is P0303, misfire number 3 cylinder. So cylinder 3 is misfiring. Now, I'm sure most of us are very familiar with this trouble code. When a cylinder misfires, it means the combustion event in this specific cylinder is not occurring, or it's not occurring properly. Now, a misfire can be caused by lack of fuel delivery in a specific cylinder, or lack of spark, or a mechanical issue in a specific cylinder. So in this case, cylinder number 3. And this code is what's causing the check engine light to flash. So now what I'm gonna do is, let's scroll down. We need to figure out if this cylinder is missing spark, fuel, or the cylinder has a mechanical problem. So we're gonna do some tests. We're gonna look at data to figure out what directions we're gonna go so we can fix this code. I'm gonna scroll down to look at the other control units. Let's see what other trouble codes we have. We have 4 trouble codes in the ABS control unit. Now, we're gonna focus on the code that we have in the engine computer because that is what the customer wants us to fix. I will notify the customer about all these other codes. We might have to print out all these codes and give them to the customer. Now, if he wants us to fix all these other codes, we might have to make another video for that. But in this video, we are focusing on the codes that we have in the engine computer. Okay, we have a bunch of trouble codes here. We have 0 codes on the generic side of the tool. Okay, so now let's go back to the engine computer. As you can see, this code is listed as a permanent code and temporary code. So let's go into the engine computer. Let's look at our code one more time. Sometimes you may have more codes as you enter in the engine computer. So let's see if that's the only code we have. Yes. So this is the only code that we have, P0303. Okay. Now we need to figure out why this cylinder is misfiring. Is it missing spark? Is it missing fuel? Or do we have a mechanical issue in this cylinder? So now what I want to do is I want to look at some data Let's go to data. I want to look at my misfire counters, and I also want to look at my fuel trim numbers, if we have fuel trim numbers here. Now, I want to look at misfire counters to be sure that what the scan tool is telling us is true, because sometimes some engine computers have issues identifying the right cylinder. I've had vehicles where I had codes for cylinder 2 while the issue was in a different cylinder. So sometimes these control units don't identify cylinders properly. So you always have to make sure you check that to be sure that the engine computer is telling you the truth, is telling you that the cylinder that's misfiring is actually the one that has a problem. So we're going to customize this list. We're going to deselect all these data PIDs. So short term bank 1, short term bank 2. So we got some misfire counters here. All these misfire data, that's what I want to look at. We just have short term. Where is long term? Oh, right here. Long term bank 1, long term bank 2. Okay, now I'm looking at my fuel trim numbers, because if we have a fuel delivery problem, we're going to have high positive numbers on the fuel trim, on our fuel trims. But if we have an injector that's leaking or seeping, we're going to have high negative numbers, because if you have an injector that's not spraying the correct amount of fuel in the cylinder, it's going to cause that one cylinder to run lean, which may affect the entire bank where that cylinder is. So if there's lack of fuel, the computer is going to try to compensate and open the injector a lot longer to spray more fuel in that specific cylinder, and that will cause our fuel trim numbers to be high positive. And then if we have an injector that's seeping, which can also cause a cylinder to misfire, what's going to happen is we're going to have negative numbers, because the computer is going to try to subtract or remove fuel out of that cylinder. So remember, it was cylinder 3 that was misfiring. So now I'm going to start the engine. Since this engine is misfiring, I don't want to run it for too long. Okay. So what does it say here? Cylinder number 3, yes. So 3 is misfiring. Okay. Cylinder 3 is misfiring. Look how we have no on cylinder 1, no on cylinder 5, no on cylinder 6, 4, and 3. But cylinder 3 has yes. So the misfiring cylinder is indeed cylinder number 3. So that's good to know. The scan tool was not, the engine computer was not lying. And our fuel trim numbers look okay. Okay, so short term fuel trim bank 2, we have 1%, so it's going between 1% and 0%. Okay, and then long term, so our fuel trim numbers are fine. Okay, oops, look at fuel trim number bank 1, and then long term fuel trim bank 1. Okay, so total trim is about 2%. And over here on bank 2, oops, we have short term fuel trim. So bank 2 is going between 0.9 and 1%. And long term is at 1% also. So our fuel trim numbers are good, okay, but cylinder number 3 is misfiring. As a rule of thumb, if your fuel trim numbers are fine, they are within spec of plus or minus 10%, the issue will most likely be on the ignition side of that cylinder. So spark, when we talk about spark, we see spark plug and the ignition coil. If we had an injector that was sipping or that was partially clogged, our fuel trim numbers will be a lot worse than this. So right now our fuel trim numbers look good. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn off the engine. I'm gonna get our scan tool out of the way. So right now what I wanna do is I wanna go under the hood and check our ignition coil and our spark plug. But before we do that, remember I said a misfire can be caused by lack of spark, lack of fuel, or a mechanical problem. What about if we have a mechanical issue? So to rule out any mechanical issues, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna step on the accelerator pedal all the way to the floor. As I do this, when I crank the engine is not gonna start. Let's see if this vehicle has clear flood mode. Let's see if this vehicle has that feature. So I'm going to crank the engine. Since I'm stepping on the accelerator pedal all the way to the floor, when I crank the engine, if this thing has clear flood mode, it's not gonna start. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna crank the engine and listen to the engine cadence. We have to listen to how the engine sounds. If this engine is healthy mechanically, when we crank it, it's gonna sound nice and consistent. So listen. Uh-oh, I think this one doesn't have clear flood. Let me step again. I'm gonna step. No, it doesn't. It looks like this vehicle doesn't have clear flood. So I'm stepping on the accelerator pedal right there. Let me turn off the engine. I step on the accelerator pedal all the way. Okay, it starts. All right. So we can't do that. We're gonna have to disable our injectors or our ignition coils to cause this vehicle to crank. Okay, because I want it to crank and not start. Okay, so we can do it several ways. Let's go under the hood so I can show you how I'm gonna disable either the ignition system or the fuel delivery system so that this engine doesn't start. We're gonna do a relative compression test. We can do that across the battery. We can look at our voltage drop across the battery to rule out any mechanical issues that this engine might have, okay? Before we focus on the ignition system. So let's go under the hood. We are here under the hood. I'm gonna remove the engine cover. I'm gonna show you what I'm gonna do so we can prevent the engine from starting. So the engine cover is out of the way. Now, since we wanna do a relative compression test to rule out any mechanical issues that the engine might have, maybe there's a mechanical issue or not, you know, we're not gonna assume, we have to test. So I'm gonna disconnect our ignition coils. Okay. So I'm gonna get all these ignition coils disconnected. It looks like someone was here and broke all these tabs. The ignition coil tabs are broken. I mean the tabs on the electrical connector. So I got all these coils disconnected. I'm gonna disconnect the coils back here. So with all the coils being disconnected, when I crank the engine is not going to start. Okay, so I got this one disconnected. I got this one disconnected. Okay, so I got all the coils disconnected. Now, when we crank the engine should not start. Since we're gonna do a relative compression test across the battery, we're gonna look at the voltage drop across the battery when we crank the engine. I'm gonna use this long test lead, this long lab scope test lead. I'm gonna connect these leads to the battery. Oops. Okay, so we're connected at the battery. Okay, so just like that, I'm gonna take this test lead and connect it to the lab scope. I have my lab scope test leads connected to the battery. I disconnected my ignition coils. So if you look at this coil electrical connector, the tab is broken. Okay, this one has a tab, this one has a broken tab. So whoever replaced these coils before broke these tabs. So I'm gonna recommend replacing these electrical connectors. Okay, all right, so now let's go in the vehicle so we can crank the engine. I'm gonna bring our scan tool. We're gonna connect our lab scope test lead on the lab scope. So black is gonna go to black, yellow is gonna go to yellow. Okay, so now let's go to our scope multimeter. We just need one channel. Okay, so right now, as you can see on the yellow trace, we are reading system voltage on the yellow trace. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to AC couple this, and then I'm going to increase my time base to 1 second. I'm going to drop my scale to 1 volt. So now I'm going to crank the engine. So as I crank the engine, we should see some peaks and valleys across the screen. And if this engine has good compression, all our peaks and valleys should be consistent across the screen. Now I'm going to crank the engine. Good. So let's bring this back. Okay, what do you guys think? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then it repeats 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is good. I mean, I like what I see across the screen. What do you guys think? Do you think this is a good waveform? I think it is. I don't think we have a mechanical problem with this engine. Also, based on how it sounds, just listen. Let's crank it one more time. Let's pause this. Okay, the engine sounds good. We have a nice consistent cadence as we're cranking the engine. We have some nice peaks and valleys over here. As you can see, all these peaks or humps have the same height. Okay, so this engine is good. We don't have a mechanical issue. So our issue is most likely the spark plug or the ignition coil. So I love this waveform. Now, if you're wondering what this is the voltage drop across the battery. So since we disconnected the ignition coils, the engine is not going to start. So what's happening here is every time the starter is spinning, it also turns the crankshaft. The crankshaft pushes the pistons in the cylinders up and down. When one specific cylinder is in the compression stroke, when the piston travels towards top dead center, you have air trapped in the cylinder with both valves closed. It's going to cause the starter to work harder. So the starter is going to draw more current. As the starter draws more current, the voltage across the battery is going to drop even further. So the same cycle is going to happen on each cylinder. So as each cylinder goes on the compression stroke, the voltage drop across the battery should be even across all 6 cylinders. So which causes all these peaks and valleys. So this tells me that this engine is fine mechanically. So now let's go under the hood. There's one more test I want to do before we replace our spark plugs. It looks like this is just going to need plugs and maybe one coil. Let's do one more test and then we will do a tune-up on this. I'm going to recommend a tune-up on this vehicle. I want to check the coil on cylinder number 3 to make sure that coil is good. If the coil is good, then we're going to go ahead and replace the plugs. So let's go to our guided component test so we can figure out where cylinder number 3 is. So let's go to engine. Let's go to ignition. Sometimes we have a cylinder layout here. Okay, this is the coil connector. This is a 3-wire coil. The first wire is ignition control. So ignition control module control, ground, and then power wire or ignition power. So it looks like we don't have our cylinder layout here. We're gonna have to go to our service info. I want to know where cylinder number 3 is. I wonder if cylinder number 3 is in the front bank or the back bank. So that's what we need to figure out. Let's go to common specs. We're gonna find our firing order. Right here, ignition firing order. Okay, this is not a 4-cylinder. So this is our engine. This is a 3.5 liter engine. So this is our engine. So the front of the engine faces over there towards the passenger side. So if we turn this towards the passenger side, cylinder number 3 is going to be the last cylinder on the bank that's against the firewall. So the cylinder against the flywheel or the flex plate on the bank that's against the firewall. So that's good to know. So now let's go under the hood. We're gonna use our secondary ignition waveform analyzer to check the third coil. If the coil is bad, I'm gonna recommend replacing all the spark plugs and one ignition coil that's on cylinder 3. Okay, so now let's go under the hood. We are back here under the hood. We're gonna use this engine ignition analyzer to check our ignition coils. I love this tool. It's very easy to use. So I'm going to turn it on. I'm going to reconnect our ignition coils so we can start the engine. Okay. I'm gonna reconnect the ones back here so you guys can see these coils that I'm reconnecting back here. Okay, so cylinder 3 is the last cylinder back here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start the engine. So the way this works is we're gonna put this yellow tip of the tool on the ignition coil, and if this coil is firing, we're gonna see our secondary ignition waveform on the analyzer screen. Okay, so if you just put this on top of the coil, if the coil is firing, we will see the secondary ignition waveform on the screen, and then we're gonna go across all these coils. Whichever coil that doesn't show us a good pattern is a defective coil. All these patterns should look the same. I mean, the ignition secondary waveform on all the coils should look the same. Okay, so now I'm gonna go in the vehicle and start the engine. So as you can hear, the engine is running. The engine is shaking. I don't know if the camera is picking this up. I'm not gonna run the engine for too long. So watch this. I hope you guys can see the waveform on the tool. First cylinder here. Okay, now ideally it would be nice if we can snap the throttle, but based on experience I can tell that this secondary waveform looks good. Okay, this waveform at idle is fine, so this coil is good. I'm gonna move it to the next coil. Check this out. This is fine. Let's check this out over here. Okay, so now let's go to the bank over here, to the coils back here. I hope you guys can see this. Okay, check this out. So this is good. This over here is good. Now cylinder 3. Look at cylinder 3. Cylinder 3 is way different from the other ones. Check this out. You see how we have this spark line over here? I have the probe on cylinder 3 right now. This is cylinder 3. I'm gonna move the tip on top of the ignition coil next to it. Watch this. The waveform here looks good. Let's go to the other one here. Check this out. So this is a good coil. I'm sorry for the glare. This is good. Now let's check the last one. Cylinder 3. Check out cylinder 3. Okay, so bad ignition coil. Yeah, so the third ignition coil is bad. I'm gonna recommend replacing 1 ignition coil and 6 spark plugs. So let's turn off the engine. We're done with our diagnosis. Okay, so I'm going to talk to the customer. I'm gonna recommend replacing these electrical connectors of these coils. We're gonna replace all the plugs and 1 ignition coil. I'm gonna get the parts. The customer already gave me the go ahead to fix this. He told me whatever you find, go ahead and do it. So we're gonna go ahead and get our plugs and 1 coil, and then I'll bring you guys back up. Now, I know some of you like to say to replace all the coils. If one is bad, replace all of them. I mean, I don't really like to do that. I mean, ignition coils usually are now replaced as a pair. I'm going to tell the customer that since we replaced one, the other ones may go out eventually, but he's a regular customer. Whenever the other ones go out, he can bring the vehicle back so we can replace the other coils. But for now, I don't see the need of replacing all the 6 coils. We can replace the plugs, but not the coils, okay? So I will get the parts and then I will bring you guys back up. A couple of hours later, we received the parts from our parts store. Here is our ignition coil. This is the part number. Okay, so we said we're gonna replace 1 coil and all 6 spark plugs. Here are the plugs. This is the part number. Okay, so I'm going to remove the 3rd ignition coil first, which is back here. Okay, so its connector looks good. I'm gonna remove this coil back here. So I'm gonna show you how I'm gonna remove the coil and the spark plug on the 3rd cylinder. Oh, the coil is wet. Oh wow. Check this out. Oh, this is why this coil, this cylinder was misfiring. You see how wet my hand is? So this coil is covered with engine oil. So the valve cover gasket is leaking. So the gasket, yes. I mean, what causes oil to get into the spark plug tube is the spark plug tube seal. So the spark plug tube seal on the valve cover is leaking. So it's allowing engine oil to go into the spark plug tube, which is getting this coil wet. That's why this cylinder is misfiring. So if we just replace the coil and the plugs, it's gonna work for a little bit, and then this cylinder is gonna start misfiring again. So to fix this properly, we're gonna have to remove the intake manifold and replace the valve cover gasket and the spark plug tube seals. After we seal this off, we have to fix the oil leak first before we replace the ignition coil and the spark plugs. Okay, yeah, so look at this. This coil is covered with oil. So this is the problem, guys. I mean, we still have to replace this coil. Since it's covered with oil, I don't think it's gonna work. I mean, we can clean it up, but I don't like doing that. I like fixing things once. So we're gonna replace the coil, we're gonna replace the spark plugs. Replacing the ignition coil and the spark plugs is not gonna fix this. We're gonna have to fix the oil leak first. We have to replace the valve cover gasket and the spark plug tube seals to fix this. And after that, we can do the tune-up. Okay, so let's call the customer and let the customer know about what we found. Okay, let's call the customer.
Your call has been forwarded to voicemail.
He's not picking up.
Trying to...
Let me try again one more time.
Your call has been forwarded to voicemail.
Okay. He's not picking up. Okay. All right. Well, I'm gonna make an estimate for the valve cover gaskets replacement. I'm sure he's gonna call me back. I will let him know. And at this point, we're gonna have to do that first before we replace the ignition coil and the spark plugs. So I will bring you guys back up after I talk to the customer.